Well, the premise of the book is exactly what the title suggests. It's what might have happened if the South won the Civil War. And I think that's something worth worrying about, because the truth of the matter is the reason we worry so much about the Civil War is the South did not win and the North did. And so I'm trying to go back and reconstruct from what we know about the way the war actually went and the reasons for it, and say, now, if we changed a few things, and we'd have to change more than one, but a few things, then what would the world be like if a Southern Confederacy was on the southern border of the United States of America?
What are some of the first things you look at?
Well, the first thing I look at is, why did we fight this war in the first place? And I won't go into all the details, but to make a long story short, it is, we went to war over the issue of slavery. There were a lot of issues between North and South, but as my daddy used to say about money, slavery may not have been the only reason that the Civil War happened, but it's way ahead of whatever's in second place. And that's important, because the issue of slavery turns out to be something that is extremely difficult to resolve. So as the war progresses, there aren't very many exit paths, so to speak, to say, let's stop fighting and see if we can settle that. We already tried all of those and they didn't work. So we have to fight it to the finish. What most people concentrate on is one of two battles. Gettysburg is one, and that's the most famous battle, and that's the one that Lee could have won but didn't. But the other one that a lot of people lately have moved towards thinking may have been more pivotal yet was Antietam. Antietam is the battle in which the British basically decided, since the South didn't win, we won't go in. And of course, it's also the battle that prompted Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And that sets the tone of the rest of the war as being a war against slavery. And the inability of Lee to defeat McClellan in what is sometimes referred to as the Maryland campaign was a turning point, in the sense that it meant that the South was now committed to having to keep on fighting, something they really weren't as prepared to do, as simply because they were a smaller country, fewer men, not the capacity to fight war that the North had. The South really would have preferred to end this quickly. And Antietam put any end to hopes for that, and any end to people who had hopes of that. The other turning point, once you get past Gettysburg, the other turning point would have been Lincoln would have to lose the election. I think that one of the premises I've always held about the Civil War is that a major thing the North had going for it was a leader who was totally and completely committed to waging that war to the end, to ending slavery and to winning the war. And that meant the election for '64 would have had to go the other way. Now, that wouldn't have happened without some things prior going different. The two things I have differently are that the Northern forces are not as successful in the West, particularly at Shiloh. And this leads up to a situation where by the time you get to Gettysburg, if the South wins that battle, it is likely to turn the populace against Lincoln, and maybe they could have Lincoln win the election and then end the war.
So now can we, I guess, tell the story of how history was in your book? Lincoln has lost the election in 1864. What's going on now?
Well, I follow what is probably a pretty standard practice for people who speculate on the outcome of Gettysburg. I have Lee winning because he does a couple of things right and because luck goes with him rather than against him, and the Union Army then has to retreat. Lee really doesn't have to do a whole lot more. He just has to stay in the North and make a menace of himself. And, well, you know the way elections go. These things sort of build and the opponents jump on it, and the next thing you know, poor old Lincoln's defending himself because Lee is rampaging through Pennsylvania. There goes Pennsylvania. He's threatening New York. There goes New York. And the next thing you know, he loses the election. The person coming in is going to be in a position to try and negotiate with the Confederacy. And it's not that they necessarily want to negotiate with the Confederacy. The problem is that with a victory at Gettysburg, the French and the English, who have been watching ever since early in the war for a chance, not necessarily to send troops to the United States, but to meddle. We're familiar with this today because you always see people coming, we will mediate the peace for you. And the British offered to do that. Lincoln would have turned them down. But in his place, the new president says, no, wait, we will let you mediate a peace. The peace is mediated, the treaty is signed, and the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis as the president, become a nation to the south of the United States of America. And that opens up a whole new world, a world that we can only imagine because it never existed. But think for a minute of the United States from Baltimore all the way down through around Florida, down along the Gulf Coast to the end of Texas. That would all be a foreign territory. It would not be part of the United States. In fact, the United States would have no real access to either the Atlantic or the Caribbean except for a narrow path from Baltimore north as far as Boston. And beyond that, it's not very good harbors anyway. So all of a sudden, the great the Atlantic coast of the United States is narrowed down to a point where it can easily be blockaded. Everything has to be funneled through there. It doesn't mean the United States would collapse of its own weight. It means that the United States would no longer have anywhere near the presence in the Western Hemisphere in terms of dealing with British intervention or French intervention. And I remind my readers that in 1865, the French had troops, technically it was the Emperor Maximilian, in Mexico. And my theory is that had the South won the Civil War, the French would have stayed in Mexico, and the British would have expanded their influence around the Caribbean. And what became, for the last half of the 19th and into the 20th century, the Caribbean as American lake dominated by the big North American state, El Norte, would not be that. There would be a South and a North, and the South would be allied to the British and to the French. And that would change the geopolitics. Now, I think it would also change the politics within the United States of America. Losing wars does not come easily to any populace. And in the case of the Civil War going the wrong way and having the South win, the Republicans would be cursed because they were the ones that started the war in the eyes of the public and then lost it. But the South would be the ones who surrendered to the enemy. And both parties could use that against the other. So my theory is you probably would get a huge realignment, probably the rise, if not what became the populace, but some third party. But mostly you would get a situation of much more instability and much less one has to remember that the actual path after the Civil War was a Republican-dominated perseverance that led to the United States becoming the great industrial nation of the 20th century. I'm not sure we would have been the great industrial nation of the 20th century had the South won that war. And the South certainly wouldn't have.
So what happens to the institution of slavery in the Confederate States of America?
You took it right out of my mouth. As far as the slaves are concerned, the irony of all this is the slaves would eventually have become free. They would have become free, not because the Confederates wanted to free them, not because of abolitionists in the North. They would have become free because the cotton market was going to collapse in the 1870s, whatever the outcome of the Civil War. And that collapse was going to cause the prices of slaves to fall dramatically. Now, slavery in the United States was a very economic institution. Even before the Civil War, half the value of invested money, capital in the South, was in the form of slaves. It's huge. Now, think of the housing market collapsing recently in the 21st century. In the 19th century, a collapse of the cotton market and a collapse of slave prices would have a similar sort of effect. It would be a financial disaster. Now, the way to offset that disaster, if prices are falling and if people expect them to keep falling for a while, is that the slaveholders would turn to the government for help. That is, after all, the American way. They would say, buy our slaves, emancipate them, get us out from under this debt, because it would become a debt, because they had paid a lot for the slaves and they couldn't repay it. Get us out from under this debt, and we would be forever thankful. Now, in the book, I probably have to speed things up a little to suit my tale, and I have that happening in the 1880s. If it weren't the 1880s, it would be the 1890s. Now, I have to quickly remind people this isn't the same as saying, oh, well, the United States would have emancipated the slaves anyway. The Southerners could do that because they controlled the outcome. And what you would have, as far as slavery is concerned, is something not very much, I would think, different from apartheid in South Africa. Blacks wouldn't be free, they just wouldn't be slaves anymore. You wipe out the economic burden of slaves being capital, and you replace it with a racial system of segregation much stronger than what we actually saw. But what we actually saw is enough to give you a clue of what would happen if Southerners had their hand free to do anything. And the one huge loser in a Southern victory in the Civil War would have been the African Americans. Because even if they were freed from slaves, they wouldn't be able to go north. Remember that, in fact, the way many, many African Americans got out from under the heel of segregation as the legacy of slavery is they went north. I don't think the United States would welcome them if it had been in the context of a war that they lost to the South.
Why not?
The same reason we don't really welcome Mexicans, Latin Americans. I think there are very strong racial aspects here that I've always told my students. One of the things that made the expansion of slavery so disagreeable to Northerners was they really didn't want blacks coming into their territories. I mean, it was simple. You don't want blacks in your neighborhood. And slavery and black were synonymous in antebellum America. I mean, there were a very small number of free blacks. But for the most part, a black person was a slave, and therefore, if you move your slaves in there, you're moving black people in there. And I have always argued that this was definitely a deterrent to favoring any form of expansion of slavery into new areas. Slavery could be tolerated, partly because Northern Americans weren't all that free from racism themselves. They could tolerate slavery if it were in the South, run by Southerners, and never touched our shores, so to speak. But they wouldn't tolerate it if they started bringing their slaves into the neighborhood, so to speak.
So now let's move into the 20th century. What would the United States or the Confederate States of America be like?
Well, in my book, I point out that one of the problems with counterfactual history, where you'll note that I keep referring back to what actually happened. Well, you can only do that up to a point, and the further on you go, it's kind of like climbing a tree, and pretty soon you're way out at the end of branches, and you've got too many branches and too many roots, and you can no longer maintain a coherent story. So I end my book, and I'm perfectly willing to concede that to some extent this is just a convenient way to close out. Ending a book, counterfactual book, is harder than starting it. I end it by saying, look, the one thing that wouldn't have changed is the world would still have been caught up in the grips of the First World War. Great powers, France, Germany, England, and so forth, still would have played out their games and fought the Great War. But I say one of the differences about this Great War is that the United States would have been drawn in, because the Confederacy would be tied closely to England and France, and America would only have one place left. That would be Germany. Now you say, oh, no, that 20th century Americans say, we'd never join up with the Germans. In 1900, the Germans were the second largest immigrant group in the United States, behind the Irish. And there are a lot of Germans, and to this day you can see it in the Midwest, in Milwaukee, in St. Louis, large German communities. So, and this actually was a factor in our not getting into World War I to some extent. So my theory is the United States would have come into the war on the side of Germany, and the Confederacy would have been on the side of the, quote, Entente or Allies, and the First World War would have been right here at home. Counterfactual history changes just a couple of things. In my case, it's some battles in the war, and then after that, you begin to see what the ramifications of that are. But you try, I had a recipe, I'll try and remember it. I believe it's 2 parts reality and 1 part imagination, and you intersperse them and enjoy a good meal. But the factual part is very important.
Is what if a question that historians ask often?
They don't ask it often openly. There's the way I put it, every historian secretly asks what if when he's writing his history, or at least if you're dealing with the historians who are writing about great events and so forth. They choose their events partly because they think they're important. Why are they important? Because if they didn't have to happen, the world would be different. If you're arguing that the world has changed because of your event, then you must be arguing that it would have been different if it didn't happen. So yeah, I think what if is very, very much there. And that's why I came out of the closet, so to speak. I think that's what my book on the Confederate States of America was. It's coming out of the closet and saying, hey guys, here's the way I think the Civil War should be taught. It should be taught in terms of people understanding what would have happened if that war had turned out differently.